All right, we have the newest trend that needs to be addressed with this lengthened position stuff. Hey, everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I thought I would chat with you guys and gals a little bit about this today. This is the newest fad. They come and go all the time to where you have all these little circles of evidence-based influencers who maybe they have a PhD from a terrible university or whatever it happens to be, and they jump onto these small trends with studies, and they take off and they contradict each other from year to year. So in other words, we had this whole obsession with, they weren't being called shortened position, but they were shortened position exercises just like 8 to 10 years ago, right? Dr. Brett Contreras with a lot of it, with his obsession with the hip thrusts and everything else, which again, a shortened position exercise for the glutes, due to all his EMG data and so on, and it became the newest trendy thing. Now we have all these people, including Dr. Milo Wolf, pushing this lengthened position stuff. And the problem is we already know the data is horrible in exercise science. These studies are small studies. And we know when we look at some of the stuff of why there can be problems. Some of it, these people are trying to purely collect data without thinking through the why this appeared. And so the whole thing you're seeing with some of these studies are showing that these lengthened position, deep focus on the lengthened position is what determines if an exercise is superior because of certain data in hypertrophy, again, purely for hypertrophy purposes. But here's the problem with this concept. This is usually being done in studies or looking at things that have a strength curve to where the most mechanical tension on the muscle is in the lengthened position. Okay, so we need to be clear on that. And sometimes the deepest stretch position, by the way, isn't always achieved by further lengthening of the muscle, such as certain on calf raises as an example. The stretching of the Achilles tendon at the bottom is not necessarily additional muscle mechanical tension. When you look at some of the data on pectorals, right, when we compare different bench press bars, what's been seen? An observation like where the researchers notice it when they go to like a cambered bar instead of a straight bar for the bench press, that it didn't cause additional pectoral activation. When they look at it, it causes more deltoid activation, the deeper stretch anterior deltoid. And in that case, they concluded, looking at it, that it was because of the tendon. So the pectoral in that case is no longer lengthening any further. It's just the tendon itself stretching, and then end up getting more involvement from the anterior deltoid. But the pectorals themselves, from that extra couple inches of range of motion, didn't receive any additional stretch, so they're not getting more mechanical tension placed upon them. So again, understanding that the deepest stretch is not always creating more of a quote-unquote lengthened position with more tension on the muscle. Okay. And some of those researchers might argue with my terminology there, but they know from a practicality perspective, they know that I'm right. There's not more tension being placed on the muscle. But all their data on this stuff works under the assumption that we're using exercises to where that's where the tension is. But here's the problem. See where I'm about to go? How about when you got heavy chains? Oh, that changes the strength curve completely. So those lengthened positions, if the strength curve is more normalized through cams, certain types of cables, devices, or even on free weights when you go to bands and chains, that strength curve is different in terms of the tension placed on the muscle. And in that case, you might see a situation to where the lengthened position is no longer the weak point mechanically with the most tension placed on it. Okay? So we need to be clear. The lengthened position is only getting more tension due to the strength curves of the weights involved and then the biomechanical disadvantage, because it's being put into a disadvantaged position. Do people understand this? And when you have another exercise where it might be a heavier strength, it may not need that. Like if we're doing even a slight partial with a heavier weight, what do we see all the time? We see great growth. Right? And I'm not talking about doing a half rep here. Like I'm not talking about a 4-board press or something. Okay? But we get in situations to where that could happen, and then we're using a heavier weight, and stimulus can be just as high. And when you observe it in the real world, people get big from doing that too. I mean, the deadlift's a perfect example. We could argue about the biomechanics on the deadlift with this, yet the studies that looked at the deadlift and hypertrophy have found it to be a ridiculously good exercise. You look at EMG data, it produced some interesting results with certain things. I'm not saying EMGs are the be-all, end-all. They're certainly not for hypertrophy, and I think we all agree with that. But in terms of at least activation, that's Kind of an interesting point. And then how many people do a bunch of deadlifts and just get crazy jacked off of deadlifts? Yeah, it happens a lot. You get pretty thick. Okay, you get pretty thick. But the point is with this, they're only looking at the point of greatest mechanical tension. And so, yeah, in those situations, it makes sense. But what happens when we start going through multiple exercises with multiple strength curves, or we start doing different stuff? It's going to not matter, right? As volumes go up, workloads go up, we create more and more fatigue. A lot of that stuff is going to matter less. But again, what happens when we change the strength curve to where the tension is no longer greatest in the shortened position? Especially we use certain cams on machines. We start adding chains, we start adding bands to different exercises to where that curve is completely different. Well, that's no longer the case, and I guarantee you it's not going to be a superior hypertrophy stimulus in those positions. And again, the other argument there is that it may be equal. It's generally not showing, the majority of those studies are not showing a superior result. And the few that have, we could argue it's a sample size problem because it's definitely not consistent. So it's clearly a sample size issue, measurement issues, other stuff, because otherwise it would be more consistent. But they're trying to claim that, well, it's at least equal. Well, yeah, only because you're being put in the highest point of mechanical tension being the lengthened position on those particular exercises. Then that makes sense because mechanical tension is an enormous driver of hypertrophy. Okay? And again, repeatedly hitting it under fatigue until we create fatigue obviously is going to work. But that, again, goes away as soon as strength curves are changed. And I would say what they're doing, a lot of it's largely due to free weight situations where they are using purely free weights with no accommodating resistance or contrast weight. So again, it's not necessarily universally true. And again, if it were also true, we would see differences, and we always go to a longer range of motion that puts a deeper stretch, but that doesn't always place more tension on the muscle. The examples I gave of the calves, the examples I gave of the pectorals with different bars. So they're obsessing over something and trying to make it the be-all, end-all, when the reality it's not. Whereas, and I think most of us who've coached a long time realize, should we probably have something that puts every muscle into a pretty good lengthened position? Yeah, it would be a really good idea in a balanced program. Does that mean that once we've done it one time that other exercises with different curves are not going to continue to add maximum stimulus when we add some variation? I'm going to say no. In fact, the real-world data, we observed that most people don't get the most amazing development possible off of a single exercise per muscle group, even if it is quote-unquote superior by their standards of going into the lengthened position. People generally get bigger who have a higher variety of exercises. And we know we also have lower injury risk too, due to less overuse. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I'll talk to you guys and gals next time.